industrial accidents, ancient
solving
poisoners,
crime,
poison
chemical
prevention.
spills. This is Toxic History.
Dr. Miller Cohn is a second-year emergency medicine resident at the University of Alabama at Birmingham with an interest in medical toxicology and the historical roots of modern emergency care.
I did my talk on Edgar Allan Poe. I think a lot of people know who Edgar Allan Poe is, and a lot of people think they know what happened to him, but in reality, we don't really know. His death is a mystery, but there's a lot of interesting theories that are involved with it. Real quick, as like a quick disclaimer, the information surrounding his death, the documents are going on 200 years old at this point. The things we know about his early life is well documented, but all the information we have surrounding his death is pretty vague. The theories that contribute to maybe how he died they're grounded in historical fact, but there's a fair amount of speculation that goes along with that. So just keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. But just to get started, this is how I feel like most people know Edgar Allan Poe when they think about him as this kind of dark, mysterious figure. And in many ways he was. But, he built a legacy on, poems and stories that kind of delve into the darkness of, like, the human mind. And it's kind of interesting how, like, the events surrounding his death are very similar in that fact that it's very dark and very mysterious and very unclear. And even the information and fanfare around his death is somewhat similar to the actual stories that he wrote and sort of parallels the things that he explored in his own works. And just to kind of get everyone's mind sort of in the right space, I want you to imagine for a second you are out, maybe you've gone to dinner or something like that, or maybe you're walking around and you come upon either in an alley or maybe on the side of the road, you come upon a 40-year-old guy. He looks delirious. He's in distress. He's obviously kind of beat up. And he can't tell you what happened. He can tell you his name, but he can't tell you if he took anything, what happened, and soon thereafter he kind of loses consciousness. This is something that we see in our emergency department fairly often. I feel like most emergency departments kind of around the country sees patients like this, essentially every day. And we have a sort of algorithm that we use to try to figure out kind of what's going on. But I want you to take that and then I want you to put that in being in 1849, where you don't have x-rays, you don't really have labs, you don't really have stethoscopes, you just kind of have your physical exam and some fairly rudimentary medicines. And that's sort of the time period that Edgar Allan Poe was in. And so that's part of why we don't necessarily know exactly what happened with him. But just to start out, just trying to give a little bit of history about our main character. He was born in Boston, January 19th, 1809. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, he died in Baltimore, Maryland on October 7th, 1849. He was the second child of actors David and Elizabeth Eliza Poe. This right here, this on the left, this is the only existing picture of his mother. There's no pictures of his father. And she was actually from the UK and came over to the States when she was quite young. After Edward turned 1, his father actually abandoned his family. So his life actually started out somewhat dark. And then actually a year later, his mother Eliza died from tuberculosis. And so after that, he was actually taken in by these two individuals you'll see here on the right. This is John and Frances Allen, hence the Allen and Edgar Allan Poe is actually from them. He was never formally adopted by them. However, he lived with them for most of his formative years. They were from Richmond. They were a wealthy merchant family. And so he actually spent most of his time living with them and living abroad in the UK. And that's actually where he received most of his formal education. He actually attended the University of Virginia starting in 1826. And for reference, just because it's kind of interesting, the University of Virginia was founded in 1819. So 7 years after it was founded, he was one of the attending classes. He studied ancient and modern languages. And while he was there, he actually notably garnered a pretty significant amount of gambling debts that actually led to his estrangement from the Allen family. And soon thereafter, he joined the Army because he wasn't necessarily able to support himself any other way. And this is actually the preserved document of his actual enlistment into the Army. You can see his signature there down at the bottom. He actually did fairly well in the Army. That's actually where he began writing a lot of his short stories, and he actually published his first couple while he was in the Army under the name The Bostonian was his surname that he initially wrote under. He actually briefly, after being in the Army, reconciled with the Allen family and then actually attended West Point for a time to become an officer, but decided that was for the birds, seemingly, and actually got himself court-martialed on purpose. He just stopped going and stopped attending classes and was court-martialed, and from there on was a full-time writer, literary critic, and all that sort of thing. He was married once. This is his late wife. This is Virginia on the right here. This was actually the only known picture of her as well. It was drawn post-mortem. And she was actually his cousin, and they got married in 1836, and unfortunately she too passed from tuberculosis in 1847 shortly before he passed. And he lived most of his life in poverty. Being a writer and a literary critic was not a super high paying and super lucrative position at that time, and actually was more famous posthumously than he was during his life, although he was somewhat well known. And this is actually the first thing he ever published while he was in the army. This is called Tamerlane by a Bostonian, as you can see, and that was actually the first thing he published, and really to not much fanfare. And he was such a strong literary critic that actually this is a cartoon that was drawn about him, just essentially listing out kind of how tough he was in the literary community. And although he was well respected, he made some enemies, as we'll talk about later, in the literary community as a whole. And so, as far as his last known movements, this is where sort of the mystery sets in. Again, I told you we know a lot about his early life. What we do know is that at the height of his success, he'd published things like The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher and The Raven, and stories that most people have at least heard of. And he'd been staying in Richmond to explore a new magazine venture where he was going to try to start his own magazine called The Stylus. And this is not the ticket or the brochure for his actual trip. That unfortunately doesn't exist, but this is the same line of boat. This is what it would have looked like. And so what we do know is that on September 27th, 1849, he got on a boat to go from Richmond back to New York, where he was going to take another job as an editor. And he actually had a fiance at the time that he was going to marry. And then from then on, we don't know what happened. We don't know what events brought him to Baltimore. We don't know. There's theories that he was kidnapped. There's theories that he maybe took the wrong train or took the wrong boat. We don't know what happened. All we know is that from then on, the next time we see him is in Baltimore. And so he's found in Baltimore on October 3rd, 1849, and he was found outside of, it was called Ryan's Hall or Gunner's Hall, which at the time was a polling station. They were in the midst of like a local election, not like a presidential election, but a local election. And so it was a fairly tense time in the city. He was found by a man named Joseph W. Walker, who actually wrote to one of his friends, Joseph E. Snodgrass. And, you know, when he was found, he was noted to be delirious and dirty, and he was wearing clothes that didn't match and clothes that didn't fit him, and overall just in a very poor state. And this is obviously not a newspaper article from the time that he was found. This is actually from 100 years later. But this is sort of just a representation of what he may have looked like when he was actually found there on the left. And this image on the right is also a sort of a representation of what they feel like he may have looked like when he was found, but will also be a little bit more relevant later on in the talk. And so this here is a map, actually. Obviously, they had to hand draw everything. And so this is a map called A Bird's Eye View of Baltimore, and it was drawn by a German lithographer named Edward Sash. And essentially, this arrow is pointing to the building where they think Gunner's Hall was, or where they think Edgar Allan Poe was found. Unfortunately, that area has been constructed and reconstructed several times over to where the actual place where he was found doesn't exist anymore. Now, if you were to go towards the left, if you were to go several blocks down, you would hit the University of Maryland, and even further down, you would hit downtown Baltimore. And then if you were to actually go south, you very soon would hit the harbor. And so he was found outside of Gunner's Hall, but they don't exactly know how or when he got there. And so before we kind of get into the theories as to how this happened and to what was maybe causing him to be so ill, we first need to talk about essentially the two individuals that gave us all of the information that we know about Edgar Allan Poe in his last days. And those are two men named Joseph Snodgrass and Joseph Moran. Joseph Snodgrass, as we'll talk about later, was who initially found him and took him to the hospital, and Joseph Moran was actually his physician in the hospital. And unfortunately, as with most of the folks back then, there's not many pictures, or there's no pictures of them at all. And these are actually two depictions of from one of his stories called The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And I would encourage you to read it. It's really interesting. It's credited as being one of, if not the first detective story ever written. And I'm not going to spoil it for you, but essentially The Murders in the Rue Morgue, part of it is that the witnesses are known to be not very credible and they give very conflicting stories. And that's partially what you'll see as we kind of try to dissect what happened to Edgar Allan Poe, is that the people that were there that could give us the most information seemingly contradict each other and have a lot of their own biases that are playing into it. And so the first disease was Joseph Snodgrass. Now, Joseph Snodgrass was a physician. He was a friend of Poe's. He was a member of the temperance movement. And he was the person that was phoned to actually come and help Edgar when he was first found. And the letter that he received actually said, "Dear sir, there is a gentleman rather worse for wear at Ryan's Fourth Ward polls who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance. Yours in haste, Joseph W. Walker." So from that point, Mr. Walker disappears. We don't really hear much else about him. But Joseph Snodgrass was the one who actually found Edgar Allan Poe. And Joseph Snodgrass, notably, was a member of the temperance movement, was a staunch member of the temperance movement in Baltimore. And he actually wrote a song. This is a picture of the song that he wrote for the Sons of Temperance. And so a lot of the information that we have from Joseph Snodgrass is somewhat clouded by this bias. And so he maintained to the end of his days that when he found Edgar, he said that, in quotes, that he was in a beastly state of intoxication, is what he describes it, and says that he died from a drunken debauchery. And that's what he would say to his death. And he actually gave numerous lectures and wrote numerous articles relaying this to the public. And obviously, most of this was somewhat framed by his bias. And the second notable witness that we have is John Joseph Moran. So John Joseph Moran, like I said before, was the physician, the resident physician that took care of Edgar Allan Poe when he was in the hospital. And throughout his life, he gave numerous lectures about Edgar Allan Poe and his death. He actually made somewhat of a career out of it. And the more he gave these lectures, the more grandiose they got and the more outrageous the symptoms and the things that Edgar Allan would say. So if you look down, initially when he wrote to Edgar Allan Poe's mother-in-law, who he stayed with and whom he was very close with, he to her initially said that his last words were, "Lord, help my poor soul." However, by the time that then this is 25 years later, was giving these final lectures and was lecturing about Edgar Allan Poe's death, his last words were, "He who arcs the heavens and upholds the universe has his decrees legibly written upon the frontlet of every human being and upon daemons incarnate." And so you can see there's a pretty staunch difference between those. And so again, it paints him as somewhat of a less credible witness than we might have liked. And so this here is a picture of the actual hospital where Edgar stayed. This was Washington College University Hospital in Baltimore. And you can't really see it very well, but there's a star on this tower. And that's where they think that he stayed. That's where they think he eventually died. And so as far as his hospital course, he was brought on October 3rd, 1849, and per John J. Moran, initially was in a stupor, whether from liquor or opium, it was first not known. And what we do know is that he was immediately taken to a private room and carefully undressed and critically examined from a emergency physician and toxicology standpoint. That's an excellent first start, is to undress your patient, decon them. I don't know if that was necessarily their intention, and try to figure out what sort of toxidrome they may be suffering from. And from there, John J. Moran essentially lists out the symptoms that he observed Edgar Allan Poe having. And he comments that he was extremely weak, his pulse was very low, and his solution to this was to give him a glass of toddy, as what he describes it. And it was it's like a stimulating cordial, that's what he was trying to say. And I think it partially is interesting to read this stuff and learn about just the medical times back then and kind of what they, had as far as medical care. And so his next step after giving him this toddy is to administer an opioid for sleep and rest. And so I think it was kind of interesting that someone that's coming in that you're concerned may have either taken too much opiates or had drank too much alcohol. Your next step is to try to give them an opiate to see if they can rest a little bit. And then throughout his stay from the 3rd to the 7th, he was noted to have periods where he was somewhat lucid but agitated and restless and seemingly delirious, to periods where he was completely lethargic and was borderline bradycardic and would go in and out of these periods of exhaustion and agitation, until finally he unfortunately passed away. And so this is the hospital, the last known picture of the hospital where he stayed. It was renamed Church and Home, and eventually bought by Johns Hopkins, but that has since changed, and it is now actually mostly apartments. And the place where it once stood is completely different, and that's what it looks like now on the right. And so unfortunately, like I said, he passed on the 7th of October in 1849. The Baltimore Clipper was the first paper to publish that he had passed. And this unfortunately is not the exact clipping from that time. But what it said was, on the 8th instant of congestion of the brain, Edgar A. Poe, aged 38, has passed. Mr. Poe was a well-known writer of great ability. That's all it said. And so his final diagnosis was congestion of the brain, or what some would say phrenitis. And there was no death certificate, there's no autopsy, there's no other existing medical record that relays what might have happened to him. It's just what we have from Joseph Snodgrass and John J. Moran. And so he was buried outside in the Westminster Church the next day. From what I understand, his funeral lasted for about 3 to 4 minutes. It was only attended by 8 people because no one really knew that he'd passed. And this is what his tombstone initially looked like, and that tombstone is still there. But in 1875, the people of Baltimore, as he had become much more famous posthumously, realized where he was buried, and they actually banded together and they raised some money and they actually built him this monument in this tomb. And so he and actually his mother-in-law Maria and his first wife Virginia are actually buried there together. And so before we move on to the theories, there's one more person we need to talk about, and this person may have done more damage to Poe's public perception than almost anybody else. And this individual's name is Rufus Griswold. He was a rival of Poe's. They were contemporaries, and he actually wrote an obituary under the name Ludwig after Poe died. And in it he said, Edgar Allan Poe is dead. Thousands will hear of it, but none will regret it. He died in an unknown, out-of-the-way hospital in the city of Baltimore in a fit of delirium tremens. And that, so as you can see, there was no lost love between these two individuals, but somehow, some way, Mr. Griswold actually became the literary executor of Poe's estate and actually benefited from the sales of his works posthumously, not Poe's family, interestingly enough. And he actually wrote a memoir called A Memoir of the Author about Poe, in which he essentially paints him as this kind of drunk and drug-addled madman that would just wander the streets and just kind of growl at people and seemingly was sort of a menace to society. And this actually became biographical in many respects, and as this was kind of the first thing published about him. And so the public for the longest time, and I think even still today, believed that this was who Poe was as a person. And in sort of a kind of interesting parallel, one of Poe's more famous stories is called The Cask of Amontillado, and in it, this man here on the left, Montresor, in an act of revenge against this man here, Fortunato, finds him in a drunken state and takes him down to a cellar and actually entombs him behind a wall, and then proceeds to destroy his reputation, not in a dissimilar fashion to the way that Mr. Griswold did to Edgar Allan Poe. And so, because of that, a man that I think most of the people that knew him from the letters that you read about him would describe as, maybe somewhat troubled, but a gentle soul and kind, and someone who most people would actually maybe represent like this, the public at large actually thinks is more like this. They think he was a very troubled, disturbed individual, and that is what came through in his writing, but seemingly that's fairly far from the truth. And so with that said, some of the more popular theories as to how he died and based on the history of, his death and his life previously, one of the most popular is essentially from alcohol. It is well known that Poe did struggle with alcohol throughout his life, and this is how he's often depicted in media. This is a movie from 1915 called The Raven, and he is kind of portrayed as a somewhat paranoid alcoholic as he tries to, find this raven that's been pursuing him. And this is actually another movie published by PBS called American Masters, and you can see there he's found drinking while riding. But if you go back and you look through some of the writings, especially from the people that knew him, and even from John J. Moran, who found him, he would say, concerning the oft-repeated slander, I hear from that Edgar Allan Poe did not die under the influence of any kind of intoxicating drink. And he would say, I found there was no tremor of his person, no unsteadiness of his nerves, no fidgeting with his hands, and not the slightest odor of liquor upon his breath or person, which is somewhat contradictory to what he said again in the beginning when he found him. However, again, like I said, a lot of the information around his death, points in different directions is part of what makes it so mysterious. And many would tell you that he actually wasn't really able to handle much alcohol himself, and typically would only drink 1 or 2 drinks before becoming quite drunk, and to where actually many people, and a famous science writer in the 90s named Arno Carlin actually postulated that he may have actually had alcohol dehydrogenase deficiency and caused him to actually be very, very sensitive to alcohol. And what we do know is that actually by the time he died, he was actually a member of the Sons of Temperance and was staunchly opposed to alcohol. However, still this is one of the more popular theories as to what may have actually happened. And along with this, and along with sort of substance uses, suspected opioid use. Poe's characters in his stories frequently use both stimulants and opioids and comment on them frequently, and the public perception was that he himself was trying to portray a part of his life in his stories. Laudanum at the time and other opioids were actually fairly easy to acquire. This is actually a snippet from a Sears catalog in which it tells you how many ounces you should use for both the young and for the elderly for different sort of ailments. It was used for fever, for pain, for all sorts of stuff. And so the initial, respiratory depression and altered state which he was found, followed by sort of the agitation that followed afterwards. There were some that theorized that maybe he was suffering from first opioid use and then possibly opioid withdrawal. Now, there's no hard evidence that he was a frequent opioid user. However, what we do have is a letter that he wrote to a woman named Annie Richmond. And in this letter, he actually lists out what many people believe to be a possible suicide attempt. In the letter, which was actually only written a year before he died, he writes to her and essentially he's telling her how much he loves her and how much he can't stand to live without her, and lists out this plan that he had that he tried to actually accomplish, where essentially he was going to take some laudanum, which he did, and he was going to send her a letter or a message saying that he was on death's door and needed her to come to his aid and give her his location. And then he would take the rest of the laudanum, hoping that she would come to find him. However, he only took the first half of the laudanum that he bought, and he actually ended up falling unconscious and was found by a friend and never actually went through with it. But does seem to be some historical evidence that this may have been true. Now, whether he was being hyperbolic or not is not for us to say, but seemingly this has fueled a lot of the theories that he may have been actually a victim of opioid abuse. And now, along with these theories, I call these the environmentals or the exposures of the time. And obviously, as we've talked about, and as most people know, heavy metal exposure was rampant in these times. It was in modern medicines, it was in makeups, it was in pipes, it was in the water, but it was also in the alcohol. So wine routinely had lead acetate actually added as both a sweetener and as a preservative. And this here is a caricature essentially from the late 1700s, early 1800s, essentially listing out the public perception from alcohol as a cure for the sick and for the colic and for the gout. And it was called the punch at that time. And many people believe that a lot of the chronic illness that Edgar Allan Poe struggled with and his worsening depression seemingly throughout his life was a result of lead poisoning or chronic lead poisoning. And then along with that, many believe that he may have actually suffered from mercury poisoning, and that may have been what actually led to a lot of his psychiatric decline towards the end of his life. He, in one letter, actually does confirm that he was actually taking calomel, which you'll see here on the left. And calomel is it's the inorganic form of mercury. It's mercury chloride, and it was a medication used for teething for infants, but also was used for cholera. He was actually exposed to cholera in 1849 prior to his death. So there are some believe that he was actually under the influence or suffering from mercury poisoning the time that he died. And notably, many also postulate that he may have actually suffered not only from arsenic poisoning, but also from carbon monoxide poisoning from the advent of coal burning gas. Coal burning was used to heat and light many of the buildings at this time. And many of the buildings that Edgar Allan Poe actually stayed at had actually have pipes that were used for burning coal. And throughout his life, he suffered from worsening chronic illnesses and headaches and worsening and mood swings. And a lot of people believe that, any of these heavy metal exposures, whether it be arsenic or lead or carbon monoxide poisoning chronically and maybe even acutely, could have contributed to his death. And so with that in mind, Albert Donna, he was actually an environmental engineer in Baltimore, took a look at several things in Poe's past. And this is actually a picture that they use, and they look to see if you look here, his eye on this side, his face is somewhat drooped, his mouth is somewhat slanted. And their theory was that he was actually suffering from peripheral neuropathy from chronic carbon monoxide exposure. And so I've told you about all these heavy metals, so why am I now showing you a piece of hair? And so the reason I'm showing you a piece of hair is because these hairs are actually the hairs of his wife Virginia and the hairs of Edgar Allan Poe himself. These were taken as essentially a memento mori after they died, and they were kept by the Baltimore Historical Society. And Albert Donna and some of his colleagues actually were able to procure some of this hair, and actually using mass spectrometry, they tested it for levels of arsenic, lead, mercury, nickel, and uranium. Unfortunately, they couldn't test for carbon monoxide. And in their hair is actually fairly fascinating. They actually looked at their exposures over time using different parts of their hair to essentially save different parts of their life as their hair grew. And they found that they had definitely levels of arsenic, lead, and mercury that would be unacceptable by today's standards, but not necessarily toxic levels that one might think would cause an acute intoxication. However, it doesn't necessarily rule out heavy metals as being a cause. But the most nefarious and actually the most widely accepted cause for Edgar Allan Poe's death is called the cooping theory. And what cooping is, it was a 19th century voter fraud tactic that was used where victims were kidnapped, they were drugged and beaten, they were sometimes forced to drink alcohol, like forced intoxication, and then they were forced to repeatedly vote for the same candidate. They were oftentimes told to change clothes, they were oftentimes were put in costumes and would vote over and over again. And the reason it was called cooping is because they were kept in sheds or what they would call coops. And they would keep them there until the voting was over. And I don't know if you remember, but Edgar was found outside of a polling center. He was found in clothes that likely were not his. And so this, even though we can't confirm it, is the prevailing theory as to what actually happened to Edgar Allan Poe. Again, it's purely speculative, but this is the theory that most historians use nowadays. And so, with this in mind, this is a quote from Edgar Allan Poe from one of his books, and it says, "There are some secrets which do not permit themselves to be told." And unfortunately, I believe this is one of those secrets. We'll never know exactly what happened to Edgar Allan Poe or what exactly caused him to pass, but I think it's an interesting exercise nonetheless, and allows us to look at environmental disclosures and the like of the age. And again, I know it's a bit of a morbid topic for St. Patrick's Day, but I appreciate y'all bearing with me, and I hope that it was something interesting for you.